Um, welcome back. Welcome back, everybody. My name is Sasha Coupe. I am calling in from Chicago, where I am on the faculty of Loyola University, Chicago School of Law, and I am privileged to serve as moderator in this afternoon's second session. And let me just join first in the chorus of thanks to the organizers for bringing together such a rich, diverse collection of voices and being so thoughtful about organizing the structure and the content of this symposium, really sort of focusing on a question that I think we don't often really sit with, which is what would it look like if we really genuinely centered the well-being of families? And it's really in that spirit that this panel is actually offering a loving suggestion to retitle our panel. So our panel is titled in the program as Looking Through Client Lenses. And very early in the conversation among us, it became clear, again, sort of the power of words and the power of labels, and how the label of client really stripped this, sort of the truth from what we were looking at, from what the system really is doing to families, and that the use of the term client really served to just further dehumanize the people who are impacted most by the system. So we are offering a friendly amendment to look this afternoon through the lens of impacted people, or looking through the lens of people with lived experience in this system. And it's been really infused, I think, into almost every panel that I've attended thus far. And here we just have folks front and center. We are going to be hosting something more of a roundtable of sorts, not dissimilar from some of the other panels, rather than a formal presentation. And that's why you'll see pretty much all of us on the screen, to the degree that Maz can keep all of our faces visible. We are, to some degree, somewhat grouped in teams by virtue of expertise and stories. As you can see, we have Sarah and a mom in the system, Elle Fresnel, who is kindly, generously, and bravely joining us today with her camera not highlighting her face. So we see that there is not a face with Elle Fresnel, who will be sharing her story. But this is really the bravest and the safest way for her to do this with a currently open case. So Sarah and Ms. Fresnel. We also have Kathy Sakamura and Courtney Joslin, who will be sharing with us the perspective of families, LGBTQ families, whose stories deserve highlighting. Marcia Hopkins and Kara Fink will be joining us to share the perspective of youth of color who are directly impacted and involved in the system. And we are so fortunate to be joined by a team of youth activists themselves, advocates, activists themselves. So Dwayne Price, Lexi Andino, Anthony Simpson, and Britt Christopher will be also integrated into this conversation, and we'd like to carve as much space and time as we can to allow them to share their stories with us this afternoon. I will be monitoring the chat, so any questions that you have for our panelists can just be forwarded to me, and I will do my best at the very end to weave together questions to be able to answer as many as possible. We suspect that we'll actually be going right up until the time that's allotted. So we have our formal panel all the way until 2 p.m. And then we'll stay collectively. All of the panelists will be collectively on this call until 2:15, when I suspect Maz just pulls the plug and we go on to our next session. There will still be affinity and regional breakout sessions available, but just a heads up that the panelists will actually all still be in this main session. So if you have questions directly for the panelists, just stick around and hang out with us until 2:15. So with that, I will again remind you that this is more in a roundtable format with three sort of critical questions that we've used to sort of organize our sharing. The first question that I'm going to put out and ask folks to respond to is just to tell us their stories with respect to the vantage that they hold. What is the current state of affairs from your vantage? And I'm going to throw that first question to Sarah and Ms. Furnell.
Thank you so much, Sasha, for setting the stage for us, and to all of the organizers. It's been said so many times, but this is a real honor and privilege, and I can't think of a more important convening that could be happening, and I just wish we could be in person. But I will jump to it because I have a lot to say, and I know we all do. Elle and I wrote about really the pervasive ableism and racism in the family regulation system, and particularly how that impacts parents with disabilities and those without. So I'm just going to lay out a few of our ideas about the current state of the system, including some statistics that give a picture of what parents are facing who are vilified or pathologized in the system, and then I'm going to pass it on to Elle. Parents with and without disabilities are really currently in a vice. Parents who may seek or need legitimate support from the state are seen as frail, incapable, and broken, while parents who do not seek to remedy purported flaws are viewed as resistant, non-compliant, and ultimately unworthy of parenthood. When parents seek support or assistance, they are immediately pathologized, and their voices, including their experiences, their intimate knowledge of their own needs and their children's needs, are ignored. Central to our thesis is that the forces of racism and ableism converge to create this dynamic and ongoing pathology. So before moving on, I was thrilled to hear that Jessica in the prior panel referenced ableism, and I just want to offer a definition briefly. It was developed by TL, or Talia TL Lewis, but they go by TL, an abolitionist organizer and attorney. The definition was developed in community with disabled, Black, and other negatively racialized people, especially Dustin Gibson. So ableism, defined by TL, a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normality, intelligence, excellence, desirability, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This form of systemic oppression leads to people and society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's language, appearance, religion, and/or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. And I offer that because to me, that is just about as close a definition to the child welfare or family regulation system that I can imagine. It is a system that places values on people's bodies and minds based on socially constructed ideas of normality. So I just want to offer now a few statistics. I won't, thanks to the groundbreaking work of Dorothy Roberts and so many who are here today, go too far into the racial disproportionality of the family regulation system because it is so well recognized. Black families are separated at dramatically higher rates than white families. And that applies also to BIPOC communities at large. But I do want to linger on the statistics about parents with disabilities because they're a part of the reason that Professor Robin Powell has described with child welfare as the, quote, backdoor to the eugenics movement. Parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities are more than 3 times as likely to have their parental rights terminated. That is 3 times more likely to have the relationships to their children legally and permanently severed, and their children are removed at rates as high as 80% higher than children of non-disabled parents. Another recent study found that reports related to caregivers with disability of any kind are 70% more likely to be substantiated. The rate of parent-child separation for parents with intellectual disability at the hospital before the parent has had an opportunity to try, to begin, to learn, to make mistakes, to grow, which nearly every parent does, whether they're a new parent or they've been parenting for years. 21.7% of infants born to mothers with intellectual disability are the subject of a CPS investigation within 1 year of birth. That's compared to 6.3% of infants born to mothers without that diagnosis. So we know that this is we can see, I think, in those statistics, evidence of this being a diagnosis-driven, biased concern. These are moments where parents are called out for disorientation after birth, moodiness or an outburst, an inability to mix formula or to read an analog clock. Most of these things are human, understandable reactions to the stress of labor. And the ability to read an analog clock and many of the other abilities called out have little to do with parenting, with love, the ability to form a family. I just want to emphasize that parents who receive special ed in high school are at a greater risk of termination and system involvement. One study estimated that parents with a disability label in their school records are more than 3 times as likely to have a TPR, more than twice as likely to have child welfare involvement than their peers. And that matters because we know Black children are 3 times as likely to be labeled as having an intellectual disability. They're 2 times as likely to be identified as being emotionally disturbed, and 1.5 times as likely to be labeled learning disabled. So led by discrit scholars, I argue that these numbers, we see an evidence of the co-creation of race and disability that is pervasive and has a long-lasting effect on the child welfare system, which I typically refer to as the family regulation system, but I am unable in this moment, apparently. So I could go on for a long time, I think, and I want to be careful about time, but I do want to say that our research really and our observations of the system show that this harms parents with disabilities and those without, and that the punitive structure of the system, such that where an identified wrong is met with a removal of a child, invasive surveillance of your home, all these coercive tactics that we're familiar with, means that successful navigation of the system often requires reaffirming racist and ableist notions of parenthood, either in a quest to prove that a parent is fit if you're the attorney, or if you're as a parent, that you meet the system's subjective notion of what it means to be a good parent and obtain appropriate and genuinely supportive services for a parent. Or in an effort to hide, and I think this happens much more than we know, many people with disabilities navigate the system without ever sharing their disability. And we will never know how many of those parents are successfully parenting because they are shamed into submission and into silence. So at this point, I'm going to hand it off to Elle. And I'm really happy to be here in conversation with you all.
So, Ms. Vernell, you are on mute. Not quite sure if you wanted to unmute.
Sure. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ms. Elle Fernell. I am based in New York City. My pronouns are Elia, she, and her. And I'd like to thank Columbia University, the moderator and the facilitators for creating this safe space to share our pain, trauma, and grief in dealing with the family policing system. I also like to thank Sarah for creating an outlet to turn my pain into purpose and eventually my purpose into policy. So with that, I would say that this is in commemoration of Juneteenth, which is now a federal and state holiday, and also the advancement of the Cairo law of the young child who was murdered by her dad, as well as baby Autumn, that we just take a moment of silence to say their names. That was children that were hurt through family court and the intersection of child welfare. Baby Autumn, Kyra, Yaquara, Daniel, and baby Gil. I say this because the children and the parents are not the forefront, are not the voice, are not the reasons why child welfare and family court exists. It is through profit, politics, and preference as the priority as to what is best needed for the families. As a mother who was ACS impacted, I was humiliated, I was degraded. My parents were also degraded. I was stigmatized and labeled as dysfunctionally disabled with a possibility of being bipolar. I was stripped my identity, where a social worker took it upon herself to write notes as saying the angry Black mother that needs to be on medication, and that it's up to the judge to determine whether or not she's telling the truth. I say that because We are now fighting to have the memorandum for families' rights passed, where secret surveillance and family policing is no longer the norm. February 2018 was when my motherhood changed from the greatest experience and moment of my life to a nightmare under ACS through an anonymous investigation called the State Central Registry. I opened my doors not knowing what will lie behind the surface. And that became the worst nightmare ever, where my truth was turned into a lie. My children's truth was turned into a lie. The initial safety conference was literally an investigation, which was then turned into an Article 10, and ACS will not release us from their care or custody as they continue to try to go through a wild fishing expedition to hold us under their terrain. I'm hoping that in this forum, those that are listening and understanding the pain that we're experiencing, the weaponization of mental health, as well as the criminalization, should be a crime. These social workers who are not medical doctors, who do not have licenses or insurance, should be held accountable and charged with felonies and convicted criminal records. No one should ever have their mental health care and their HIPAA rights violated, where ACS will literally change your mental health care records and dispute it when you think that that is not something done. The medical health experts are not in those courtrooms. It is us versus them, and them taking your children away from you silently and stripping your legacy, your last name, and convincing your children that you are a monster and your kids don't need to be with you. At that very moment, my children became very afraid of ACS and no longer wanted to be around them. And I was penalized by not being allowed to see my children for the last 16 months because I spoke up and out about the egregious, inhumane, and cruel treatment that my family and I were subjected to. And our pretrial case has transpired for the last 3 years. It was kicked out of trial the first time and then brought back to trial a second time, only to be further humiliated. And as a survivor and a victim of domestic violence, this case is now turned into a custody battle where my perpetrator and abuser also tried to criminalize my mental health care to discredit my character, my capability, and my motherhood, only to be reinforced by ACS false narratives to fuel the school to court to the prison pipeline. And we stand in solidarity. I thank the organizations in New York City for being a support system for me when no one understood the nightmare that I was going through and still go through today. I just like to take this time to thank everyone for listening and to help us change the policies that are in place and to reunite us with our children as the reunification has declined and ACS continued to message the fear mongering and hate of Black motherhood, brown motherhood, and immigrants to take our children away and never see them again, and to put us on the SCR child registry for 28 years where we're economically sanctioned and cannot attend PTAs or Bible school studies with our children because of the tactics that are allowed by ACS social workers under the government immunity. So with that, I'll pass that to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Elle, for sharing your pain and your story. We're honored to have you as part of this panel. Sarah, did you want to add before we shift to Courtney?
No, I'll rest on Elle's words. Thank you, Elle.
Powerful. Courtney and Kathy?
Great, great. Yes, and thank you, Elle, for sharing your story. So powerful. So as Sasha said, my name's Courtney Joslin. I'm a professor at UC Davis School of Law, where I teach and write in the areas of in family law with an emphasis on LGBTQ families, which is the focus of our remarks today. So I also wanted to say I'm just so honored to be here participating in this conference. And to be here with the other members of this panel, especially the youth and parent advocates. And thanks to the organizers and the staff and Sasha for moderating. So just this term in the Fulton case, which was actually decided just yesterday, the Supreme Court grappled with questions related to discrimination LGBTQ people may face when they're seeking to adopt or foster children who are currently in the child welfare or family regulation system. But despite what has been pretty sustained consideration about that form of anti-LGBT discrimination on the back end of the system, there continues to be almost a complete blind spot about anti-LGBT discrimination that can cause the children to be in the system in the first place. That is discrimination against LGBTQ families of origin. And indeed, the very existence of these families is rarely even acknowledged. And I think part of the reason that these families continue to be largely invisible is that there's a really sticky stereotype that LGBT people in general and LGBTQ parents in particular are predominantly white and middle class. So I want to start our remarks today by providing a bit of demographic information to make sure we have an accurate picture of these families. And then Kathy will spend a few minutes talking about some of the particular challenges that these families face in the system. So what the research reveals is that contrary to that stereotype I just mentioned, LGBTQ people are disproportionately likely to experience poverty as compared to non-LGBTQ people. And this is especially true for transgender people and for bisexual women. Indeed, almost a third of transgender people and bisexual women live in poverty. They're also more likely to be people of color as compared to non-LGBTQ people. They're also disproportionately likely to have disabilities as compared to non-LGBT people. And with respect to LGBT parents specifically, here too, the data belies the myth of affluence. So these parents are actually more likely than non-LGBT parents to be living in poverty. Overall, almost a quarter, about 24% of children being raised by same-sex couples live in poverty. And about 1 in every 3 individuals in same-sex couples raising children are people of color. So given this demographic data and given what we know about this system, it's not surprising that the little empirical data that exists suggests that many of these families are child welfare involved. The results of one of the only empirical studies examining the experiences of lesbian and bisexual Black parents of origin in the child welfare system are, to use Nancy Pollicock's words, they're staggering. Specifically, it found that parents who reported being lesbian or bisexual were more than 4 times more likely to have lost custody of their children when compared to their non-LGBT counterparts. So that gives us some picture, some more accurate picture of this population. And having laid that context, I'm going to hand it over to Kathy now to talk about some of the particular challenges these families face once they enter into the system.
Thank you so much, Courtney. I'm Kathy Sakimura, and I'm the Deputy Director and Family Law Director at the National Center for Lesbian Rights. I want to thank everyone for having us be part of this panel, and especially to Elle Furnell and the youth who will be sharing their stories. I think we are not bringing voices directly, we're still sharing through us the voices of LGBTQ families. I have my primary practice over the last 15 years has been appellate litigation on behalf of LGBTQ parents and parents of LGBTQ children in the family court, in the family law system. And then some more recently, really doing more representation in the child welfare or family regulation system, and really has, through their stories of what has happened, allowed us to really see what is happening to LGBTQ families in this system, which really is not being talked about in our movements or communities in a way that's bringing it to the surface. And through their stories, I think you really do see what is really happening for people. So the experiences of LGBTQ families of origin, of course, many of them are feeling the same challenges that all other families involved in the system are, particularly because, you know, the majority of LGBTQ families, as far as we know, involved in the system are poor. There are also people of color. There are also people with disabilities. They're experiencing the bias and discrimination on those grounds as well. In addition, there's some specific bias related to sexual orientation and gender identity that LGBTQ families involved in the system face as well. One aspect of what happens is that they're experiencing anti-LGBTQ bias, of course, in the rest of their lives as well, which can render them more vulnerable or likely to become system involved. They, for example, one qualitative study talked about or shared some experiences of parents about how when they became homeless, being unable to even access a homeless shelter with their child, especially for transgender parents, facing gender segregation in homeless shelters, excluding them from being able to have even minimal shelter with their children, and of course then leading to system involvement for lack of shelter. And then many LGBTQ parents have been rejected by their own families of origin and don't have family support systems to help them when they are experiencing crises and, you know, help them with caring for their children. And then, of course, once they become involved in the system, they're also experiencing anti-LGBTQ bias from social workers and judges and juries and service providers within the system. So I think one piece that comes up is this persistent stereotype, which is the opposite of the stereotype that Courtney shared, that LGBTQ people are overtly or inherently sexual and inappropriate for children to be around. And we see these stories also in especially the older family law proceedings of, you know, same-sex couples holding hands or hugging being seen as somehow sexual and inappropriate to happen in front of children. And that, we believe, may lead to some of these ideas that parents are inherently harmful to their children by virtue of being LGBTQ. And then finally, for LGBTQ parents, an issue that arises is the lack of recognition of many LGBTQ parents because they are not biological parents. So many LGBTQ parents aren't biologically related to their children. They may have a partner who is, the other parent is, and they're not. And that, the way that states treat the recognition of non-biological parents is very different across states, and some states recognize some parents and some don't. But also, even when there are protective laws, we see there's a lack of understanding or knowledge by families and even by judges and attorneys within the system about what protections may exist for families, and then thus seeing families not being recognized as parents within child welfare proceedings. Finally, I just want to note that we also see a thread of parents of LGBTQ children who are supporting their children's identities, having their children be removed and being investigated for abuse or neglect based on that support, particularly for mothers who support transgender or gender nonconforming children, especially if they were assigned male at birth. There is this persistent thread of mothers forcing their children to their sons to be girls and abusing them or neglecting them in some way because of that. And I'll talk a little more about some stories in a later question related to that. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathy and Courtney. We're going to move on to our youth advocates. Kara and Marcia have invited Anthony Simpson to share his story in response to the question of how things are sort of unfolding right now. So is Anthony there?
He is here. I think we're both going to collaborate a little bit, and I'm going to pass it, Sasha, if that's all right. And to be clear, I think Anthony's going to share more information about what's happening, what we're seeing happening with older youth in care. So I'll let him introduce that. But good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marcia Hopkins. I'm the Senior Manager of Youth Advocacy Program and Policy at Juvenile Law Center. So I have the amazing opportunity to work with older youth who have lived experience in the foster care system to push for policy reform and work on different various campaigns both on the national level and the local level. So what I briefly just want to talk about is some information and data on what we're seeing in terms of rates of removal nationally with youth of color being removed from their families and some of the disparities that we see across the board. So I'm going to share some data. So about a quarter of children in the United States in foster care have been removed from their Black mothers. Data from 2000 to 2011 shows that 1 in 17 white children, 1 in 9 Black children, and 1 in 7 American Indian children were removed from their parents in care. Other data also suggests that African American children are less likely to be reunified with their families than compared to white youth. I think what we would say in our youth advocacy program, and again, what we're seeing on a scale is that this is the system that deems itself more fit than families of color to care for their children. That's been a consistent rhetoric that we've seen, I think, since its inception. One thing I like to highlight when I do these presentations is that when foster care first came to be and we first created something to quote unquote protect children, families of color were actually excluded from that. They were not actually able to receive services. So I think it's no shock to us to see that then now that they are eligible for services, they're the ones who are more likely to experience violence, criminalization, and be policed by the system. It was not a system designed to actually protect families of color. And so we continue to see that. In terms of what we're seeing with youth of color, young people are disproportionately left in the child welfare system longer than white children, left without familial bonds and connections. And significantly, the number for youth who have aged out of care across the board, not just children of color, has consistently remained between like 20,000 and 23,000 every year, aging out into homelessness, not having any family connections. I think that is atrocious that we see that number every year and nothing has actually changed. And the system has not been called out for shelling out the number of children that it shells out every single year into homelessness and without any family connections. I think the other thing that we really want to highlight, and you'll see that in our presentation, is that there is also a serious lack of protection for children in foster care that has not been significantly called out. I think overall, we're seeing nationally, there's a big push for juvenile justice reform, ending not criminalizing children and placing children in boxes. And people are forgetting that children in foster care are also placed in boxes in group homes and are experiencing sexual violence, physical violence, verbal abuse, and other things. And they have been left and demoralized the same as children in the criminal system to fend for themselves. And so I think that's something that we really want to put to the forefront, is that like kids are not protected in the system, even though this is a system that has called itself quote unquote designed to protect them. And so I'm going to pass it to Anthony to share a little bit of information. And we're keeping this brief because we will play our video where we show much more information about what we're seeing. So Anthony, I just have to say, I'm so grateful to do this with you and really proud to do this work with young people because I think their voices are often unheard in the system. And so I actually feel deeply honored to do this work with them.
Thank you so much, Marcia, and thank you to all of the previous panelists, especially Elle, whose story is probably going to be with me for the rest of the day. In terms of the current state of child welfare as it relates to older youth, I think it's important to note that as a Black and Brown youth, you are more likely to have your situation be in detriment as you enter into the child welfare system. Due to the over-adultification of Black and Brown youth, oftentimes we'll find ourselves either having to be overtly independent within the systems or have ourselves kind of be ushered into the juvenile justice system due to there being a lack of empathy when it comes to unpacking the decision-making made by younger people. Also, this adultification can lead to more harsher penalties when we're in court. You know, as children, we're prone to lash out and have emotional outbursts. But as a Black and brown youth, I'm seen as someone who's older and therefore someone who should have more control over my emotions. And furthermore, and even more unfortunately, my outbursts, which may be more innocuous for a youth that is of the majority, as a minority youth, my outburst is seen as more of an act of aggression. And as you can see, when we get further into the video, you'll kind of see just how the heteronormative and cisgender normative nature of the system feeds into this further subjugation of youth of color, and also in consequence, resource parents of color. And so as we see more and more, you know, resource parents get turned away or turned down due to their gender or their race identity, you start to see more and more households be fit into the mold of a mom, a dad, a white family with a picket fence that lives in a certain type of neighborhood. And as youth are kind of sent further into these homes, their cultural identity and their racial identity is further pushed into the back as they kind of start to kind of strip away the parts of themselves to be more palpable for the system. But that's just a little piece of what we're talking about in our video. I do want to pass it back to Mar so we can get it started and you guys can just take a look at some of the data that we looked into and just some of the numbers that, you know, unfortunately they won't shock you, but they should put a little bit of fire under you to understand that the system needs to change.
Actually, I do not have anything to add from his amazingness, so I'm going to pass it back to you, Sasha. Thank you all for having us. And like Anthony said, all the stories are powerful, and Elle, absolutely. As someone who works in this field, who also was in foster care for 8 years as a child, you know, hearing the stories and the connection to, you know, my community and the experiences that my Black mother had in foster care, you know, this is so meaningful. So thank you all.
I cannot thank you guys enough. I'm going to borrow Elle's really powerful call to turn pain into purpose and purpose into policy. And you have all, you know, shed light on countering perceptions about communities with the reality of people's lived experiences and how powerful your truth is and how underrepresented that is. I'm going to actually take the liberty to combine the next two questions. So we have asked folks to share their perspective on the kind of current state of affairs, and then to collectively do some envisioning. What would the system look like, including abolishing the system, but what would the system look like if indeed the voices and the stories and the experiences of people impacted by the system were truly at the center? So it's both sort of how does centering how does centering your voices matter, and then what does a reimagined system look like? We're going to combine those questions. We're going to go again in the same order, so that means that the video will actually come after Courtney and Kathy, sort of when we circle back again to JLC and the youth advocates. So I'm going to kick it back to Sarah and Elle to just shed light on what would a new envisioned centering of people's stories and experiences look like.
Elle, do you want to lead this one?
Oh, you're on mute.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So once again, thank you, and my heartfelt sentiment to everyone that was justice impacted. I would say the narrative needs to change to universal justice and care reform. The intersection of child welfare and family court mimics the criminal justice system. So when we talk about defunding the police, we need to talk about defunding ACS and shifting the monies back into the community for community-based operation where it takes a village to raise a child. I am advocating that if we continue to use ACS, that ACS have to have body cams, wear uniforms. We need access to the database where parents and children are making complaints about caseworkers and how these social workers are being addressed. We're asking for the memorandum rights to be read. Parent equity. Currently, if your children are being investigated for an allegation, the fathers are having a difficult time to remove the children from the system, and children are being taught that, you know, your mom, for example, my daughter said to me, well, Mom, you'll be able to get us back when you take your medication. And she's 8 years old. I almost flipped out because I'm like, who told her that I'm taking medication? But since you want to talk about medication, let's talk about you becoming a physician and referencing your science book to understand that there's vitamins, there's over-the-counter, and there's prescribed. Which medication are they referring to? So we need to tighten up our HIPAA rights and how it's being used. Parents are unaware of their rights. We are not aware that we're supposed to have access to court reports, court records, and transcripts. Our voices are lost. We're advocating for a family court watch, where currently there is no jury in family court. And children can literally be ripped apart from a parent's hand in the courtroom. So we need to have accountability, transparency, and a way to strengthen the due process and statute of limitation in a more speedy way to prevent children from languishing in foster care, or even more of a diversion program to prevent them from even going in. And last but not least, hold these social workers accountable to the fullest extent and remove the government immunity and start prosecuting ACS social workers. And I'll pass that back over to Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you, Elle. I just, so Elle really picked up on a lot of the reforms, I think, that that she and many of which I really believe need to take place. I want to focus a little bit on what happens when when the only voice in the courtroom is a lawyer or ACS or caseworker or a judge. I mean, anyone who's been in family court recently knows that parents are often invisible. And I just want to focus on what's lost in that moment. That, you know, parents with lived experience are the people who understand most specifically how the system fails them and what kind of support they actually need. They're the ones being told they are inadequate. And so if you sit in a family courtroom, you'll hear caseworkers and judges bemoan that a parent just isn't benefiting from services, that they've tried everything, they've offered every cookie cutter service they can think of. And this is when that you hear parents are unable, unwilling, they can't retain information, maybe they're unmotivated, they question their love for their children. This is where blame becomes part of the system most, I think, overtly, because I've heard caseworkers testify. They need reminders all the time. I am always repeating myself. I say the same thing every time. And the reality is that repetition is an accommodation for many, many forms of disability. Repeating yourself is part of your job if you're a caseworker. Working with the person before you is part of your job. And when this happens and parents are asked to complete multiple duplicative services, none of which necessarily address the parent in a way the parent can understand or provides needs that this parent actually, or rather provide supports that the parent actually needs. And not only do these cycles sort of not serve families, but they certainly don't justify or satisfy federal or state requirements for individualized service planning or reasonable efforts. And they become a cycle that really forces parents out of the role of parenting. And I think if we listen to parents, they would tell you exactly the supports they need and want, whether it's direct financial support, access to medical services, and by that I mean money to see private, high quality doctors that they are otherwise denied, housing, direct support is what most parents need and want. And without their voice, we don't hear what they need and want. And, I also just want to quickly reflect on the conversation Elle and I had recently, where we talked about if you were centering the voices of parents, you would naturally identify better legal representation. Because instead of having just sound bites of a parent, as she put it. You would hear their whole voice. And I don't think I could say it better myself. And just on the second point of the question, and then I'll stop. You know, I think if we really centered parent voices, we would dismantle the system. That would be the natural end point, because it would lead, as I've said, I think, to direct investment in communities. And Elle talked about some of the reforms that, as there are so many parents currently crushed, so many families currently being devastated by the system, that I think are necessary between now and the day that true divestment from the system can take place and true investment in families can take place. But I just want to amplify that some of those are especially important for parents with disabilities. Many adults who grow up identified as having a disability have never been given the opportunity to make their own decisions. Without Miranda rights, without an understanding that they can say, no, thank you, I do not want to talk to you, I have the right to a lawyer, they are much more likely to be taken advantage of. And we know parents without disabilities, when authority figures walk into their room, they feel just as vulnerable as any other human would. They do not understand they have the right to say no. So I just want to emphasize the real importance of Miranda in this context. Similarly, representation from the outset of an investigation immediately, so that a legal counsel is available, not once you're in court, as in the majority of jurisdictions that even offer representation, but from the moment, so that parents are not led to believe that they have no choice but to comply. And we different panels touched on this yesterday. But parents are often misled and manipulated into sharing information that they're not legally required to share, and that goes immediately into petitions. And finally, I just want to touch on mandatory reporting and how necessary for this particular population, but for all parents, ending mandatory reporting. We need to completely separate legitimate sources of support and systems of punishment and surveillance. If parents can't safely seek support because they know they'll be reported, we have a cycle that will not end. And for adults with disabilities, they are very likely to be interacting with many more parts of social services. And that's something like, I think, 19% of cases in New York State that come into the child welfare system or the family regulation system come in through social services organizations, right? And that's where people go for support. That's what we're taught to do. But they're also, by those same service supports and parents and teachers who are where 17% of those reports are coming, much more likely to be regarded as suspicious or with bias and seen as unable to handle their children. So ending mandatory reporting would not only be, I think, a huge non-reformist reform for the system at large, but would have a really disproportionate impact on parents who necessarily interact with the system at much higher rates.
Thanks so much. I'm going to kick it to Kathy and Courtney with the same question of how does centering the stories and the truth and the experience of LGBTQ parents and kids impact the system? What would a newly envisioned system look like that would center their truth?
Thank you so much. I mean, I think as we can see with all of the stories that we get to hear from parents and children and youth is that if we truly valued the stories and experiences of people who are impacted by this system, it would have to be changed. There is no way that if we valued what people are actually experiencing, that the system could continue the way that it is. I think it's easy for people who don't listen to these stories and don't have this kind of ability to hear people's stories, but think in the abstract that this makes sense. You need to make sure people are safe. And that really just cannot possibly on its own exist if we really value stories. I wanted to tell at least one story about one of our clients, about a mother that I was able to represent on appeal, and one of my colleagues, Asaf Or, represented at the trial level. He's just this incredible advocate, especially for parents with transgender children. And I think so much of her story illustrates so many of the things that have come up in this panel and come up through stories, as well as specifically what happens with anti-LGBTQ bias and how that plays a role. So our client, this mother, she had 3 children. She was mostly caring for them on her own with some limited involvement by the children's fathers. And her middle child is gender nonconforming and assigned male at birth. She, even despite all of the challenges of being extremely poor and having, 3 children on her own and all of the things that come with that, sought out, a child psychologist that she could see through Medicaid to consult with about what she should do about her child, and was advised that she should let her child lead and follow her child's lead. If her child wanted to express a certain identity, to do so, to use a different name, to just let the child express themselves, which she did. And she really tried to, deal with as best as she could the fluidity of the child's identity and make girls and boys clothes available, to talk to schools and care providers about, what the child needed. And she became targeted by the child welfare system, probably through complaints from school and other care providers, who were really just in shock about what she was doing, supporting her child expressing a more feminine identity at times. And the initial petition was dismissed by the court for lack of jurisdiction. And then the department brought another petition and sought a jury trial, which the ability to hear these cases in front of a jury is just a terrifying aspect of some state systems, where they presented a case that was really focused on how she was forcing her child to be a girl and how it was impacting the other children, and how that the children wouldn't end up in foster care. They should just go with their fathers, and really turned it into essentially like a child custody proceeding in front of a jury, focused on how she was supporting her child being a girl or forcing her child to be a girl. And then all of her children were removed and placed with their fathers. We appealed, and the first appeal was, they affirmed the jury's decision, acknowledging that the removal and the presentation were biased and were based on anti-transgender bias and were on gender identity, but upholding the jury's decision with the great deference that's given to juries. Then we appealed to the Michigan Supreme Court, and at that time, a new attorney general was elected, and we reached out to her to say, this case is happening, which had been really vigorously defended by the AG's office for the actions of the department, including, blaming her for showing her children how she was a victim in surviving domestic violence. Like, the whole presentation of the AG's office was extremely offensive. So that they withdrew their defense, and that really helped, I think, get us the summary reversal. But then what happened? She'd already been years. This had been going on for years. She was on the child abuse registry, which Ms. Furnell mentioned is this terrible aspect of what happens. So, and her children were removed based on a finding of neglect under the facts of what happened. And then she was placed on the child abuse registry. She had been a daycare provider, so she couldn't get work. She became homeless. Then she was unable to get custody back of her children, even though the child welfare proceeding was dismissed in the child custody cases that she had, because she didn't have housing and stability. And it has taken her years to get back to a place where she can begin to have custody of her children again. We were eventually able to get her removed from the child welfare registry, but even after the case was dismissed, it was difficult to do so. I think that case just illustrates many aspects of what happens, this fear around LGBTQ people, as well as all of the other harms and biases that play into the system.
Great. So thanks so much, Kathy, and to everyone else. And I think it's interesting, even though each of us on this panel are approaching the topic from slightly different perspectives, I think there's just an incredible amount of overlap about our ideas about what kind of radical transformation is necessary to alleviate the harms of systemic racism and all of the other inherent biases that are baked into this system, which harms so very many families. In our piece, we offer a number of different recommendations with regard to this transformation. I'll just highlight a few here because, again, I think there's a lot of overlap. One of the things that we recommend is changing the federal funding incentive scheme. The scheme is currently, it incentivizes the outcomes that we know cause more harm than good in most cases, which is the removal of children from homes, the termination of parental rights, and the shattering of families. And at a minimum, this has to change. Instead, as Sarah and as Elle suggested, the scheme needs to incentivize just the opposite. It needs to incentivize the maintenance of families, not their shattering. And this is all pretty obvious, but more concretely, states should receive more money for greater numbers of families that they maintain. And then this greater funding needs to be used to support families. This could be used to provide housing for families who are housing insecure, food for families who are food insecure. It could be used to provide subsidized childcare for working parents who need childcare in order to get to work, or to provide schooling and training to parents who need help entering into the workforce, and the myriad of other supports that low-income families may need to support themselves and their children. And also to emphasize something that Sarah mentioned too, rather than having this support come from the very agency that is in charge of overseeing and monitoring and policing these families, these services should be provided instead by independent community-based organizations. I want to just echo one of Sarah's points, which is the elimination of mandatory reporting, which we talk about in the piece. Sarah did a great job, so I won't belabor it, but I did want to echo it. And then the final point is just to echo something that Kathy just mentioned and that Elle mentioned, which is to end these child abuse registries. We've seen a really successful movement in recent years to ban the box with regard to employment applications, with regard to prior arrests and convictions. And we need a similar movement to ban these child abuse registries. They're registries for listing child abuse and neglect records. And while they're supposed to be confidential, they can be used for employment screenings. And as Kathy suggested, where that happens, it makes it much more difficult for parents on the registry, parents who are already facing so many hurdles, to get a job they need in order to support their families, in order to keep their families together. And it is just part of this very vicious cycle that these families face. And I'll stop there. All this is to say, certainly that there's so much change and so much work that needs to happen. But I do want to end by saying this conference and these really important conversations are such an important step to making this necessary transformation a reality.
Thank you so much, Courtney. I'm just going to co-sign that. As we take it to Kara and Marcia, I just want to let folks know the video that you're about to watch. This is the video that Anthony had referenced. It's about 15 minutes long, so it'll sort of take us into technically the end of our panel. But we are going to be inviting our youth advocates to come on the line and be spotlighted to engage in a Q&A afterwards. So I invite all of you to really still just stick around. And I'll ask Maz to go ahead and queue up that video.
Welcome everyone to Reconstructing the System One Youth at a Time. I am Britt Christopher, a 30-year youth advocate with Juvenile Law Center. My pronouns are she, her, and I entered care when I was 13 and left when I was 16. Lexi, can you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Britt. Hey everyone, my name is Lexi. This was my 4th year with the Youth Fostering Change program. My pronouns are she, her, and I entered care at age 10. I exited at 17. I re-entered at 19 and then aged out at 21. Dwayne, if you want to go.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dwayne. My pronouns are he, him, his. I've been with Juvenile Law Center for about 2 years now. I entered into care when I was 12 years old, and I'm currently still in care in an independent living program. I would like to pass it on to Marcia.
Thank you, Dwayne. Good morning, everyone. My name is Marcia Hopkins. I'm the Senior Manager of Youth Advocacy Program and Policy. I entered care at age 4 and I left at age 12. I'm now going to pass it to Anthony.
Hey everybody, my name is Anthony Simpson. I'm a 5-year alumni fellow with the Juvenile Law Center. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And I entered care when I first turned 16 and exited when I turned 18. And I'd like to pass it to Kara.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kara Fink, and I direct the Interdisciplinary Child Advocacy Clinic at Penn Law School. And I have had the pleasure and privilege of working with all the advocates in youth fostering change over the past 9 years. The Interdisciplinary Clinic pairs law students and social work students together to represent older youth in foster care cases in Philadelphia. And as a part of our focus on client-centered and trauma-informed lawyering, we have had the Youth Fostering Change Advocates speak at our seminar each semester, where they are the experts in teaching our students and our advocates on how to best advocate for youth. And it has been a privilege to collaborate with the Youth Fostering Change and Juvenile Law Center over the past 9 years. And I'm going to turn it over to Marcia to give you a little more information about their programs.
Thank you, Kara. Juvenile Law Center is the oldest nonprofit public interest law firm in the United States. We advocate for the rights, dignity, equity, and opportunity for youth in the child welfare and juvenile justice system. In our youth advocacy program and at our office, we believe in the inherent power of youth voice. We believe that young people should be at the table and paid for their work. So every year we work to recruit young people ages 15 to 22 to be in our youth advocacy program to fight for reform. I'm now going to pass it on to Dwayne to talk more about our program and the work that young people do every year.
Thank you, Marcia. Since 2008, Juvenile Law Center has created 2 programs focusing on making sure that youth have experience in and out of the system and have an opportunity to speak about their experience in a comfortable environment without judgment. Youth advocates also share recommendations on how the system should be run. These 2 programs are focusing on foster care and juvenile justice. Each year, we young people pick one or multiple topics that will focus on making sure that we enhance the experience for all youth in and out of the system for years to come. The topics include expunging juvenile records, having better access to education and mental health, and so much more. The way we do this is by connecting with other organizations and government officials and connecting with the community to see if we can change a lot of old policies and making sure that lots of people know that youth in the system should not be forgotten and that they deserve better, just like the rest of us. Thank you, and I would like to pass it on to Anthony.
All right, so now let's take some time to talk about the current state of the child welfare system. 1/4 of all children in care are older youth between the ages of 14 and 21. These youth average 3 or more placements during their time in care. Less than 1/4 of these youth receive transitional services in employment, housing, or education, and only 20% of youth in care attend college compared to 60% of their peers. This also directly contributes to the school to child welfare to prison pipeline. Whereas we all know about the school to prison pipeline, the added intersectionality of child welfare keeps kids within a cyclical cycle within the system that allows them to constantly either re-enter, or if they're not re-entering the child welfare system, directly allow them to re-enter the justice system. Pandemic also made it worse for youth in care. Lack of PPE provided is significant. There's also a lack of technological support for youth who are working from home or attending school from home. And even now, there's a fight to get resources, which, if you think about it, is completely antithetical to the point of the system, because a lot of these kids are being taken from homes where parents didn't adequately offer them resources. So to enter a system that also doesn't properly provide these resources, you can see how that can contribute to youth disengaging from the system. The system is also inherently racist. They strip youth of their culture and their community. And the idea that resource parents are being discriminated based on sexuality feeds into this narrative that a cisgender heteronormative system is exactly what's needed, when really this system caters to an inherently racist demographic and model. This ideology kind of bleeds into the experiences of youth within the system, specifically young Black men, who are often seen as super predators and more dangerous than their other peers. And folks often don't want to deal with the young thug. Now I'd like to pass it to Britt with notes from Asha Lee talking about reimagining a family-based system.
Alrighty. Thank you, Anthony. I'm Britt once again, and I will be speaking on Ashley's behalf. He can't make it with us, but here I go. We must reimagine a family-based system. Why must we reimagine a family-based system? Everything is wrong with it right now. People don't care about the kids in the system. They just care about getting their jobs done. It doesn't really help you. And once you age out, you're either homeless or you're struggling like a whole lot. These things could have been prevented if people in the child welfare system actually cared. People don't care because it's not their kids. What we need to do is we need to hire people who care about what they're doing instead of just doing their jobs. We need to know that the child is always better off with their family or a family friend. Instead of the child welfare system, there should be something that gives children and their family an opportunity to be elevated and see if they can be supported and not taken from their homes. If there is a problem, then it should be solved first without sending them away from their family. I should wish would be that children never come into the system in the first place and that the whole family gets the supports and help that they need. I'm gonna swing it to Alexis.
Thanks, Britt. So the system doesn't value our families. They didn't respect my family enough to consider them for kinship, not even my biological grandmother. And they put me in a position that I had to run away to get the attention I needed to stay with her and get myself into trouble. And then they didn't respect us enough to help me transition as my grandmother was passing. They don't see us as a family. You can tell them you have family that is not blood, but to you they are, and have maybe been more to you than your real family, but they would tell you that they aren't. And I believe family is about connections, love, and support, not DNA. Relocation versus removal. The system relocates us, but relationships with our families and our communities are not removed. They don't value these relationships or help us foster and build on them. You have to fight to maintain these relationships on your own. I ran away to see a family friend and had to run away to see my family, like my mom, to get help or support. Even while traveling in and out of the city alone while I was 13, I had no phone and no means to communicate with anyone I cared about or who was helping me in my life before I entered care. You should never get punished for trying to use your support system or surround yourself with loved ones and your family. Thank you. I'd like to pass it to Dwayne.
Thank you, Lexi. And it is a real shame that, unfortunately, that the system of today has already failed so many families and lots of youth. I speak of this from my own experience and for the rest of my friends on this video call. There is a massive difference between how white families are treated than Black families or families of color. In today's world, opportunities aren't given the same for Black families and youth, leaving lots of room for failure and mistakes to happen. The view that the system has for Black families shows that the level of respect isn't there. In their eyes, each family is precisely the same, which means everyone will be getting the same or similar treatment. The system is supposed to help youth, and many families receive good services, but instead, families have been torn apart. Children are being taken away and placed in a more uncomfortable environment, which isn't helping anyone, but the system make more money. The longer a child has to go through these experiences will affect their daily lives and relationships with themselves and others. This includes losing family connections, creating trust and abandonment issues, and leaving youth clueless about functioning in society. I want to say thank you to everyone. After explaining all of the challenges that youth and families face in the system, it is a shame that so many barriers exist for families and youth. So I have one essential question that I want to ask you all and would like you to think about. To all the social workers and leaders in the child welfare system, if it was your family, would you do the exact same thing with the same rules and regulations and stipulations to your family that you did to ours? If you had the opportunity to take what we receive, would you accept it without any hesitation? Thank you, and I would like to pass it on to Marcia and Britt.
Thank you for that, Dwayne. We believe reconstruction can occur if we as a society offer concrete supports for parents and families. Insurance services are offered regardless of race, gender, and sexuality. That means going down all the options a family have and letting them decide what's best for them and then moving forward with it. We can also create and fund systems for youth and families with lived experience to be paid for their time and their expertise in reforming the system. That means not only identifying with youth and families with lived experience that can not only share what they know that can help the system grow and reform, but also paying them for their time that you're taking out of their lives. As a society, we must humanize working with all families and respect families of color, regardless of who they are, Black, Native, Latinx, and other families of color, and LGBTQIA families as well. That means just treat everyone with respect and that dignity that they deserve. Don't dehumanize anyone, regardless of your beliefs and how you feel. This one is very, very important. Take a youth-centered approach. This means being mindful of youth trauma, individualized experiences, and surroundings, knowing what to say and who is in the room, ensuring youth and family legal teams all understand the goal and are working towards it. So basically, not only being trauma informed, but also understanding that everyone is different and giving that individualized support. Making sure that everyone on the team is working within the goal of the family and the youth, and not the goal that and not know everyone else's own individual goal. So we all are on the same page. This last one is from Marcia. Tell them how.
Thanks, Britt. We also believe reconstruction means that we can reconstruct society to have a family-based support system that is outside of the current child welfare system. We believe abolition is really important and that we need to work towards abolition in all of our daily practices and remind ourselves that abolition is a process. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much, Kara and Marcia and the youth advocates for taking time to put that together and to share your stories. I want to invite you on the line now to join in the spotlight. In order to do that, Maz, our AV person, has said you will need to have your camera visible. So just a heads up. But Kara and Marcia, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Hi, everybody. No, I just want to add that, Marcia and I, and hopefully all the youth advocates who are on with us, we're doing a, maybe not so silent cheer at all the hard work and the suggestions that were put in. This was about a 10-month-long process, and I am going to cede my time because I think we don't do enough of that as lawyers. And I think to truly think about lived experiences and what it means to be a part of this system and to start listening, I want to turn it back over to the youth and hopefully open this up for questions. But I didn't want to let this opportunity go to publicly congratulate them for all of their work and their thoughtfulness and their bravery in trying to rethink a system that has caused a significant amount of trauma in their own lives and their families' lives. And that is a very big ask that we made of them. And I so appreciate all that they have taught me. Marcia.
Yeah, I just want to, I thank them on a daily, but, I'm grateful to, honestly be in partnership on a daily basis at my job to collaborate with young people. I think especially older youth, because they are a community that is often ignored, like Anthony talked about, and as the youth shared. I just think they spoke truth and power to what's really happening. And, I think, the question we had earlier, like what would happen if we actually listened to like youth and families, we wouldn't actually have what we have today if people actually had the opportunity to speak about who they are, what it is that they need. And, I think the youth, are real and raw and always put it to us in our work that we do every day that like, it really is a system that has said that my family doesn't matter, that they can take better care of me, and they're not taking better care of me. And so, and then they don't want me to say that they're not taking better care of me. And so, you know, I know that I ask so much of them every day to do this work with me when some of them are still dealing with the implications of the system. And so I just have mad love and respect for them to, you know, stand in community and solidarity to do this work, knowing that sometimes they may not reap the benefits of the work that they do. And I think that that is something so powerful when you have families and young people who are literally saying, I'm coming to the table, I'm gonna do this work, knowing that you devalue me and that you may not even give me the thing that I'm actually fighting for my peers and those after me to get. And so I just have immense respect for them. I get emotional talking about it. They, you know, they really work so hard. So I'm gonna pass it to them.
Anthony, you want to comment?
Yeah, definitely. I just want to thank all my colleagues for the hard work that was put into the presentation. I am definitely looking forward to any questions that you guys have, so I don't want to take too much time on my comments. But yeah, you know, the system, once you get into the system, you really never leave. You know, you might leave on paper, you might even leave in terms of proximity, but you really never leave. Those issues never kind of leave your life, unfortunately. So yeah, I just want to uplift everything that Mara said, because, you know, everybody's fighting silent battles, but to kind of put down your weapon and turn towards the main issue and kind of charge towards that one with reckless abandon, it definitely means a lot. But also self-care is important, and that's to our social workers in the room who have no care experience. You know, self-care is important. So as much as, you know, we're called to do this work, and as much as we're gifted in the ways that we can make change, it's also important to take stock in your own emotional availability and just take note of the amount of emotional labor that this work truly takes. Yeah, so if any of my colleagues don't want to say anything, then we can get to questions. But I don't want to cut anybody off.
Listen, Ant said it best. Mara, you had something to say?
No, I'm passing it to you, Britt. Whatever you want to say and share.
Listen, Ant said everything. He literally took the words out of my mouth, so I'm good.
Britt.
I wanted to echo what you guys said too. Thank you all for listening and being here.
Dwayne, did you want to share anything or say anything?
Yes, I just wanted to say thank you for everyone listening. And Ant, you said it all. You said it on point. And like Anthony said, that the system, we may leave, but it will always be with us. So I think that's important to understand and take in.
All right, I'm gonna jump in with sort of moderator's prerogative. Folks have been sending in comments, supportive, certainly, of the focus of this panel and people speaking their own truth. I want to share that we will share the link to the definition of ableism that Sarah shared at the top of our panel. That was really powerful, and I think it just sort of resonates for so many folks who heard it and want to make sure that they can incorporate that into their own working definition. I'm curious because I know that so many of us on this call have a role to play in training, teaching, molding, acculturating the next generation of lawyers who will play a pivotal role in this system. And I'm curious, how has your own work, making room at the table, giving up your seat, centering the voices and the stories of people with lived experiences, how does that show up in how you teach and train law students? I'm gonna ask.
Oh no, go ahead, you can ask. I'm a social worker, but I just want to make one point. And I feel like I'm going to pass it to Kara, or obviously anyone else. I think one thing that's important, I did a presentation to a group of law students. Sasha, were you? No, I don't think it was Nacha. It was, it might have been the University of Chicago. But one important thing that I think to note when our youth and myself, when we train lawyers, is that the legal system also was not designed for families. And so the way that lawyers are taught to represent families is also based on a very inherent implication that like families don't have all these capabilities and that lawyers know best. And then the other thing I think that's important to know as you are teaching your students, and we have an opportunity to do this when we collaborate with CARA, is that one is not designed for them, but there is a historical narrative and perspective about the legal system that people fail to actually teach lawyers in the way that you get from like a presentation like this that everybody has done. And so again, which like, when people say that like you're fighting for justice, and I want to emphasize a point that all the youth and Anthony said is like, once you are tied to the system, it never truly leaves you. And even when we represent and get an opportunity to get things for our young people for their cases, it's not truly justice. Because even if we collaborate as Juvenile Law Center with another lawyer and we are able to get that youth reunified with our family, all the implications from that system and the things that happen to them has not left. So from my perspective as a social worker who works and also in collaboration with the legal profession, it's not really justice for families once they're in. We have done so much significant damage that it's just not enough. And we need to teach lawyers that, because a win for your kid is not always a win, because once they are in, it will be with them for the rest of their entire lives.
Great point.
Yeah, I think I could just build on that. I mean, I think acknowledging forthrightly how subjective the law truly is, not just family law, but all law that's meant to seem to appear reasonable, to appear evidence-based, but is in fact highly, highly subjective and focused on creating a policy or many policies that disadvantage some and advantage others. And whenever possible, actually like steeping class in the history and in the reality of the lived experience of so many people experiencing the law, as opposed to the broad theories and ideas that we learn about, especially in our doctrinal classes, but really thinking about what the reality of those experiences are.
I would only add to that, Sasha. I think, you know, one of the best things that I done, and I credit one of the organizers and my former clinic professor, Jane Spinak, of teaching us and having it in my clinic, is really having folks with lived experience actually come and be a part of your clinic, because it makes you challenge your assumptions that you have as both a law student and a lawyer. And working with the advocates, I learned something new every single time we meet, every single time we talk about the article. The multiple times that we worked on the recording, I learned something new about assumptions that I held, and it really forces you to take a critical perspective to your lawyering, to the system. And I think anytime you do that, you're creating better lawyers. And I also think the introduction and inclusion of non-legally oriented scholarship and non-legally oriented readings is critical, particularly in the child welfare family regulation system, because this is not a sort of solely legal practice, and the work that we do a disservice to the families that we're working with if we treat it that way. So I think a combination of all those elements is a way to move our own lawyering for experienced lawyers a little bit farther, but also to train the next generation of what I hope we can move away from saying child advocates or parent advocates and parents attorneys, and move into attorneys who support justice for families.
That's awesome. So just a couple minutes left. I just want to turn it over to our youth advocates. So Anthony, if you have anything to share, or Ms. Furnell, if you would like to close us out.
Oh, okay. So hello, everyone. I stand before you as a mom. I also stand before you as a community activist and an artivist. And what resonates with me in my community is when they said, they may have taken everything away from you, but what they can't take away from you are your accomplishments, which is the reason why I ran for office, to become a vessel and a voice for the voiceless, the broken, and the unheard. So as we continue to power up and challenge the status quo and change child welfare as well as family court. We also need to create new jobs and identities for justice impacted and consider them to also be attorneys and create a forum for that. So as a spiritual child of God, I would be remiss to leave everyone with Jeremiah 29:11 and continue to fight and prospering for all families, because all lives matter, whether it's today or tomorrow, regardless of what color you are. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I guess please everybody join me in thanking our panel today. I've got nothing but gratitude for you sharing your expertise and being so candid and so pointed. We've all learned something. So I have a feeling Mouse is going to pull the plug in about 60 seconds for folks to go on to the next panel, but it has been a pleasure to be with you this afternoon.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry.
Will this panel be up to view again?